Which one of these do you think is faster? This little Quillon dagger or this 5-foot, 7-pound Montante? The answer seems obvious. You probably guess that the dagger's faster, but you don't know exactly how much faster, do you? What about when I compare it to this much shorter and slightly lighter tree felling axe? This is about 5 pounds. Is the answer still so easy? Is it just based on their base weight or their length? A lot of times when people talk about weapons, they'll tell you which ones are fast or which ones are slow. But there haven't been many attempts to actually put some numbers to it. Games like Dungeons & Dragons say that you can do a certain amount of actions in 6 seconds with a weapon, but is that accurate? What is that based off of? Did somebody test that? Probably not, because doing a speed test with weapons is actually incredibly difficult. What factors make a weapon faster than another weapon? Is it boiled down to their base weight? There's a lot of things to consider. Is it even a proper representation of that weapon, considering a lot of weapons have various different variations? And then there's the proficiency of the practitioner who's using the weapon. And even then, everybody uses weapons slightly differently. You can't just hook it up to a machine that swings every single weapon the same, because certain weapons require different handling. So I decided to just give it a shot to see what we could find out, kind of like a test of a test. The method I used is pretty simple. Myself and 2 other martial artists with different weapon proficiencies each tested over 50 different items. And I say items because not all of these are weapons, some of them are tools. With each of these items, we performed several different actions. We did them several different times, and then we averaged the results. So there were 6 tests total. Not every weapon could do each one. There are 2 90-degree cuts, one with 2 hands and one with 1 hand. There are 2 different thrusts, a standard thrust, and then another one thrown with your non-dominant hand. There are some simple up and down cuts, and then a series of crosswise cuts, also called Zerkows in HEMA. So I figure between the 3 of us and all these different tests, and a large enough sample size, if we're being consistent, then we can discover as much as we possibly can about how fast certain weapons are. For the weapons, I tried to get the highest quality pieces that I could and the best representations of those pieces. In fact, many of the weapons tested are antiques that are several hundred years old. Don't get quite more legit than that. Now, a small amount of the weapons that we tested are purely reproductions of what you might call fantasy weapons. That is, weapons that appear in movies, video games, or anime, or they're just not inspired by anything from history. I added these weapons along with some of the tools because I wanted to see how they compare. How does a functional combat axe match up against a fantasy double-bitted axe, and how does that match up against a modern wood-splitting axe? So the bulk of this video is just the testing. If that's not interesting to you, you can skip ahead. There should be chapters down below. That is for the validity of the test. I try to make it as entertaining as I can. We will talk about every single weapon, introduce you to them so you know exactly what kind of weapons we're testing, and you can see how we're handling them. After this section, there's some deep analysis, and there's also a quick run-through. Alright, so that's enough of an introduction. This video is already long enough. Let's just jump right into it. This is a generic Walmart pocket knife. It's the $10 knife that everybody was talking about a couple years ago. And I gotta say, it is a high quality knife for the price. It basically weighs nothing, but while a lot of my other knives have fallen apart, this one is still just as good as the day I bought it. It's small, well put together, and basically weighs nothing. So there's our first entry, the shortest and lightest weapon in the entire test. We even did the 2-handed cut with this weapon, even though it doesn't have room for 2 hands, because we wanted to represent the fastest possible time that we could reach. The first set of numbers is the time it took to complete each test. The second set of numbers is based on that time, and it's a calculation of how many times this item can perform that task in the span of 6 seconds like Dungeons & Dragons. And that's just a little extra work I decided to do to give each item a score that might be a little bit easier for people to process and understand.
This is an extremely basic cruciform dagger. Todd's Workshop makes this one. So we're throwing it in here for the speed test. It weighs almost nothing, so we're going to be able to use it pretty fast, I think.
So very close results with the pocket knife, but it is interesting that a little bit heavier, a little bit longer. Even though these times are extremely close, just milliseconds or even less away from each other, there's still a uniform increase in the amount of time it takes to complete each test.
But this one's kind of special. This is a Tanto from the 1500s in Japan. It's not signed, because most things from the 1500s were not. And this handle, the handle wrap is modern. This was done by Darren Steele from Steelborn Blades. Highly recommend his work if you need one. He is a great tsukamaki.
So yeah, like he said, this is an antique. I just wanted to point that out. There's going to be several items that we use here that are actually hundreds of years old. It's really amazing we were able to use so many. And this one is an absolutely terrifying cutter for its size. And once again, a little bit longer, a little bit heavier, and it took just a little bit longer to complete each test.
Okay, so this is the Hanwei studded spiked steel mace. Not really sure of the material. It's got the leather braided wrapped handle, leather lanyard for holding it so you don't lose it. It's nice and spiky. It's got good weight.
So even though this weapon is just under 2 pounds, its weight is mostly in the head of the weapon, and you can see the results are drastically different compared to the last 3 we just did.
This is the Bruegel Messer by Todd Cutler, and this is just a really good example of the type of long knife that was carried by the peasant and worker class in that time period. It's inspired by the artwork of Bruegel, who, if you've never checked him out, check him out.
Alright, so this one was just over a pound, and much more in line with the gradual increase that we saw from the first 3 weapons.
Here is a cold steel cinquedilla. It is a triangular blade, mostly used as a sidearm. It's got 3 fullers in it, making it lighter than it appears. Really good for thrusting and really agile for cuts.
So this one's very interesting. The cinquedilla is very close to the weight of the mace. In fact, its stats are closer to the Bruegel Messer, which is almost 9 ounces lighter than it. Very solid, balanced weapon.
This is just a very nice mace, done again by Todd Cutler. It's they're not complicated devices. This is a particularly fancy looking one, but they're essentially a glorified club. Pretty effective against somebody who's wearing a helmet. You can still deliver a lot of impact. It's got those points on it, which causes it not to slip or deflect too much. And shockingly light and nimble, honestly.
So the flange mace, almost indistinguishable from the spiked mace. And even though it's lighter than the cinquedilla, it's not nearly as fast.
Also by Todd Cutler, but this is a more high status version. One feature that almost all Messers and related weapons have is the nagel. It's this little protective bit right there. It's used basically for catching other blades. So you have a little bit of hand defense on a weapon that otherwise would be pretty lacking for it.
Now this one's really interesting. Despite being lighter than the Bruegel Messer, the Burnware Messer was completely slower in every single test. Now granted, it is not by a lot, milliseconds or even less. This is the Norse-style hawk from Cold Steel. It's basically a tomahawk that's shaped like a Norse-style weapon. It's obviously much broader than a typical tomahawk. They're pretty much exactly the same weight. They feel exactly the same, even though there's this big difference in the broadness of the blade. The way that the axe head protrudes up slightly, you can actually stab with it. Point of balance right about there. The farther away that the point of balance is from your hand, the more torque that you have to deal with. That's kind of the way axes are. All the weight is up at the head. But this is nicely balanced, so it's not putting much stress on my arms. So the Norse Hawk was very close to the maces in terms of speed, even though it weighs the same as the Bruegel Messer.
So this one is also an antique. This is a Cora. And this one is weird. This is an interesting sword. Not even optimized for the cut. I would say only usable with a cut. There is no edge or really functional point to it at all, and the edge is on the inside of the curve. It's extremely forward weighted. It would deliver really powerful cuts, but confusingly has this disc guard on the pommel, which really bites into your hand when you cut with it. Looking at historical pictures and examples, it seems that after a certain point, they mostly had this guard on them. Used historically and today for animal sacrifice, supposedly used for combat in the past, I suspect, with a different pommel.
Man, this one was interesting. The Cora is forward weighted, and that weight also dips down. So probably great for cutting very certain things, not great for achieving viable combat speed.
This is a wakizashi. This is an antique. It's from the late 1600s, signed Omi no Kami Hojoji Tachibana Masahiro. The signature style seems to indicate that it would be signed by the second generation of that family of smiths. This is kind of unique in that the curvature is very shallow and it is very tip nimble.
So this antique wakizashi is longer and heavier than the Norse hawk. It's not super forward weighted like larger Japanese swords. It's actually incredibly well balanced. This is the Cold Steel Gunstock War Club. It is a Native American weapon that came around the early 16th century. It was supposedly fashioned after the shape of a rifle stock. This one we're using is made of polypropylene. These weapons have a very unique balance to them because of their shape. They can be used forwards or backwards, which changes their balance drastically depending on how you use it. And it has a very nasty triangular spike at the front of it. So a very interesting weapon, kind of like the Cora, but in reverse the way we used it. But the ability to use this in two hands really improved on how fast it can go in comparison to the Cora, regardless of which way it went. This is a bearded axe, also known as a skeg ox. It's called that because of this little beard that protrudes down from the bottom of the axe. Personal preference of mine. They're really handy because they can hook your opponent's shield or their weapons. They're very light. This is only 2 pounds. Point of balance is right about there. The thing about this axe, it's supposed to be a one-handed axe, but the handle's a bit too long. Obviously I can use it two-handed, but if I want to use this one-handed with a shield, I would rather the handle be a bit shorter. You can't have a whole lot poking out the bottom of your hand because as you're moving over, the shield doesn't get caught. And when you're doing that with such a long weapon, you're holding that weight that's up here farther back, and that can affect the speed of a weapon like this. I'm not surprised that this weapon didn't do great in one hand. There is an image in the Bayeux Tapestry of an axe that is very long being used in one hand with a shield. This weapon did slower than I expected, even though it feels pretty good in hands. But the numbers really don't care about how I feel, do they?
This here is the Specialized Goza Cutter by Chenis. It features a wider, thinner profile blade to allow for cutting in tatami mats. It has a normal katana length handle, but a smaller wakizashi size blade, which allows for quicker draw and indoor fighting.
Joe didn't record enough footage to fill out the time for this one. But basically, yeah, this is not a normal katana. It's specially made to be short and deliver powerful cuts against tatami. And having that awkward balance did affect its results. It's made for cutting, not for fighting. And that makes this a very valuable entry in my opinion. This is the Lord of the Rings Urukai Sword Scimitar by United Cutlery. It's officially licensed. It's modeled to be an exact replica of the ones from the movies. It is fully functional, it's sharpened, but to put it simply, it's a flat slab of metal with a really nasty spike on the back of it. Official media says that this weighs about 8 pounds, but in fact it only weighs a little over 3. There's no counterbalance, it's completely forward weighted. The only hand protection that you have is this little forward protrusion of the blade. I have done a dedicated video on this weapon. Man, I gotta tell you, this one was a surprise. Despite being the heaviest weapon that we've tested so far, it didn't do too bad, except for the one-handed cut, which felt awful. But that is interesting because it's usually used in one hand by the Urukai in the movies. But in two hands, it works great.
So this one is a Dark Sword Armory Sika, which is a fantasy weapon based off a gladiatorial weapon used in the Roman times. It could be used to get around shields, to clip the back of the ankles or behind the neck. It could be used both ways because it is double-sided blade.
Really interesting weapon with a less extreme curve than the Cora, though lighter and longer with a double edge on it. It's a pretty cool weapon.
This is a good example of something that is not optimized as a weapon. It's very front heavy. It's two-bladed axe. It's just used for splitting wood, really, like chopping down trees specifically. One of my buddies gave it to one of my other buddies as a gag gift at Christmas because as a kid he had to split a lot of wood. And then he had to leave it here because he lives in California and he couldn't fly home with it. So I have it sitting here and we'll use it for speed test. Right up near the head. Yeah, it's just about as front heavy as it gets. I can't think of any swords that would have anything like an equivalent point of balance to that. It's just very heavy, very front heavy. You know, obviously, it has seen some use in splitting wood. That's what it's for.
Beautiful. So by far the heaviest weapon we've tested so far, but definitely not the heaviest one we're going to test. While it's extremely slow in certain categories, it did do well in the up and down cuts due to the fact that it has two edges, so it didn't have to realign on its way back up and down.
It's an arming sword by Todd's Workshop, part of his new line. I really like it. It handles very nice. Todd makes good stuff. As long as you're not looking for machined perfect. If you're looking for something a little rustic, I highly recommend his work.
So the arming sword is very balanced, one-handed weapon. We did forget to do one test with it, mostly because we're morons, but because there was a lot going on and we were talking and stuff, and just kind of got lost in the shuffle there. Which is unfortunate because it's an extremely balanced one-handed weapon. Something happened to the audio or something. I don't know why Joe's not talking. I messed up. I don't know. This is a neat Chinese sword made by L.K. Chen. It's really interesting. It has a straight single-edge wedge blade with a sheep's foot tip. You can tell this thing is a beast at chopping. So the Songhand Dao is actually closer to the Urukai scimitar than any other weapon on the list so far. Pretty interesting comparison. I think it only suffers from the fact that the Urukai scimitar has a spike on the back, so it can attack from both sides, which means it doesn't have to flip the blade when performing the Zwerchow or the up and down test.
This is the Gunther Messer by Landsknecht. It's really well put together. Messers are great. They're kind of unique in that it's unusual to see a one-handed sword of this size that is really just designed to be used in isolation. Usually something like shield or something like that, but the Messers usually just used by themselves. So despite its big choppy appearance, it's super light, it's super nimble, really good thruster because of that clip tip.
For such a broad and beefy blade, the Gunther did very well. It's deceptively light, and it did overall good in every single category. So this is just a standard machete. This is just a tool. As an improvised weapon, though, they're great. They're extremely fast, but obviously zero defense. In Haitian machete fighting, they actually teach you to defend yourself with static blocks, keeping the tip up. So here's some very interesting results. The machete did overall very good. Despite the fact that it's super lightweight, it didn't do as well as the other ones that are in a similar weight category. And that's probably due to the little bit of extra length that it has and the torque that it produces.
So this is the Zombie Tools Defos. It's one of their inspired pieces of the Roman Gladius. Scalagrim did a destruction test with this bad boy. Chopped everything that he put in its path, which is one of the reasons why I bought it, because I knew how durable it was. I mean, 5160 steel, aluminum scales for the handle, leather wrapped. They have this nice little stone wash on it to give it the apocalypse feel.
So this thing is basically a fantasy weapon. I think it's really interesting how all over the place the stats are for this one.
This here is the Roman Auxilia Spada by Albion. It has a diamond cross section, which is good for slashing, as well as for the thrust. This long sword replaced the gladies on the battlefield. One of the cool features is with this cup hilt design and ball pommel, which allows you to lock your hand in. It also features these cut grooves for your fingers to really lock it into place.
I was a little surprised by this one. Ends up mostly on the lower half of the ratings. Another weapon that's just very comfortable in the hand.
So this is another antique. This is a tulwar from the 1700s. It is very specialized to the cut, and the handle is very tight. It basically prevents you from doing this, which is normally what you want to do with a saber-style weapon. These were used for close-up drawing cuts. The blade is a really good example of nonlinear distal taper, where it's thick, 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 and then thin near the tip, almost paper thin.
The tulwar is really interesting. It's not heavy at all. The thing cuts like a lightsaber. The disc pommel sucks, it digs into your hand, but it does lock the sword into your hand. I suspect that the results here are due to the extreme curve on the blade, causing the momentum to kind of whip around as you cut with it.
This is a good Viking era reproduction by Dark Sword Armories. As Viking era swords go, it's a little on the light side. It's like 3 pounds, but weighted properly. You know, it's very tip heavy. It's very choppy, as it should be. And I like the fittings on it. I think they're nice.
Small pommel.
Yeah, definitely a small pommel for a Viking age sword. But this is authentic. There were swords like this.
Now, this one's not a typical Viking sword. I couldn't get my hands on a very high quality, typical version of a Viking sword. This one is a nice piece, but man, it's really forward weighted. It's just murder on the elbows. Still, though, it does do about as good as other one-handed swords.
So this is the 10-pound hammer from Home Depot. This is a Razorback, pretty cheap. I don't remember because it was like how many years ago. Bought it to split trees, little tree trunks. Get the little spike on. Sledgehammer! I am the game.
All right, Kyle.
Nice.
The sledgehammer, the single heaviest weapon that we tested. And obviously all its stats are in the bottom 10%. This is one of those where we didn't do a Zwerchow with. It was so slow that it could hardly be said that we were even doing the move. And I honestly felt that the risk of injury of throwing this kind of weight at such an awkward angle just wasn't worth it.
This is a Civil War era non-commissioned officer sword from 1865. I guess I'd classify it as a type of spadroon, although I'd say it's definitely a little bit more rigid and has a little bit more blade presence than most spadroons. It's a fairly solid, chunky object. Point of balance is a little bit further out than you normally see in a sword this size, so it feels more like a steel bar than a rapier.
Well, despite being something like a steel bar, the cavalry sword did very well. Its Zwerchow speed was curiously very slow, and I suspect that's because the point of balance is as far out as it is.
This is the Albion Laird. It's a nice arming sword by Albion. Obviously, it's an Albion. It just feels great. Quality is amazing. The furniture is supposedly of Scottish origin. They sell this blade with a couple of different styles of hilt on it. I went for this one because I liked how it looked. But it's, I would say, a little bit tip heavy, but that's pretty normal, I think, for a sword of this type. You're talking just post-Viking era, I guess. So, yeah. Choppy and a lot of authority to a cut.
Another arming sword. Its stats are pretty in line with the other arming swords, except it did a little slow in the Zwerchow. And that is, again, also probably due to the fact that it's a little tip heavy.
This is an Albertina. It is specifically a sword from the Sardinian War of Independence, named after General Albert, who was apparently a beloved figure of the resistance. It was a failed campaign. Sardinia is still part of Italy, and the grip is unique. You put 2 fingers through there, and it actually gives you a lot of leverage. This is unique to basically to the Albertina.
The Albertina is almost identical to the American cavalry sword. The difference being that little ring inside the hilt that gives you a little bit of extra leverage. And that might have been why it did so much better in the Zwerchau category, despite being almost completely similar.
This is a Jian by Hanwei. It's actually a really nice reproduction of older Jian in that the blade is not super flexible or floppy. It's balanced and tapered more like a historical one rather than like a wushu one, which I think most of the modern practitioners have sort of moved towards. So it's pretty rigid as these things go. Nice long grip, pretty sharp.
Now this one's pretty interesting. It did overall very well. We used it in one hand because that's how they're typically used, but it actually could be used in two hands, and we did film some of that, and it did much better in two hands than with one. Impressively, as a one-handed sword with a broad blade, it did just as good as the Albertina and the cavalry sword.
This is LK Chen's Frontier Dao. It's relatively light, actually apparently intended really to be used in one hand, and you can certainly use it that way. Now, the fittings on this are reproductions of fittings that we find in Japan where this was found. Are they original Chinese fittings? We don't know. These fittings were probably made by Japanese people later on. This, incidentally, is the inspiration for the katana. This is the sword that basically emigrated from China to Japan and then was copied and modified and turned into what we know as the katana today, and then that knowledge transferred back to China and influenced sword making there.
The Tang Dao is a very balanced weapon. It did surprisingly bad in the two-handed 90-degree cut. I think that was mostly my fault, but we'll talk about that later.
So this is a katana. It's signed Yamashiro no Kami Fujiwara Kunikiyo. That family of smiths operated between 1624 and 1736. And this one also has the kikemon, which is this little lotus right here. That is a insignia that indicates this family of smiths was in the favor of the emperor at the time. There were a lot of smiths that were allowed to put that on your blade, but apparently if you were not allowed to and you put it on there anyway, you could be killed. So just kind of a neat little bit of history.
This antique katana is probably the most legit katana in this test. It only seemed to fail in the thrust, which is kind of curious. But either way, it was cool that we were able to use this. This is a legit Edo period sword. A time of peace, but probably one that was in the possession of an actual samurai and used or intended for actual battle. This is a double axe, or a double-bitted axe. This is purely a fantasy weapon. Double-bitted axes are depicted in art, and we know they had some ceremonial use also. They're attributed to the Amazons, though this axe is much bigger. Both axe heads are symmetrical, unlike a tree-cutting axe. The blade is larger than a tree-felling axe, but there's less metal in it, making it much lighter. It doesn't have the wedge of a tree-cutting axe. It has a very thin blade like a battle axe. The horns of this axe actually give it the ability to thrust, and it has what you might call a bearded portion at the bottom of the axe for grabbing shields and hooking weapons and armor. This is one I'm glad I got my hands on. It's hard to find a good double-bitted axe with a lot of weight on it. They do get a little more crap than they deserve, but I'm being a little biased because I just love double-bitted axes. I think they're probably my favorite weapon type in fantasy. But as you can see, it does way better than a tree-felling axe, despite there not being much of a weight difference. And it even keeps up with the skegox in certain categories. Because it has two blades to it, it doesn't have to realign the edge for the cuts, and that's very important.
So this is a colonial Spanish rapier from the 1700s. Part of our representing of rapier-style weapons in this set of weapon tests. As rapiers go, it's on the light side, definitely. And it's a little bit on the short side, because it's a later period rapier. Things were starting to transition towards smaller weapons at this point.
This is our first entry that is a rapier. It's actually really interesting looking at how close the Jian, the Albertina, and the cavalry sword are to this sword. This is the Raptor sword from Windless Steelcrafts. It is meant to be a functional fantasy sword, and it really is. It is single-edged. The back of the blade has no edge on it. The forward quillon forms a knuckle bow, while the back quillon sweeps upward, which is weird, maybe for sword catching or something like that. Its pommel sweeps forward, sort of like a claw. It's not sharp, and it helps with leverage and pulling as you push with your cuts. This is a good example of a functional fantasy sword, as I said, and its performance shows it's just overall quick and graceful weapon that pretty much just needs a back edge.
This here is the Hanwei Shobuzakuri from the Raptor line. It has what they refer to as the iris leaf blade. It does not have a Kasaki on it in the blade profile, making it perfect for cutting, as you do not have a fragile tip.
The Shobuzakuri was very close to other swords of a similar make in a lot of the categories. And considering how much power this thing has, it doesn't actually sacrifice that much speed.
This here is the Kingdom of Arms Cressy. It features a cruciform style crossguard. It's a Type 16 blade with a hexagonal profile, meaning it's hexagonal and then tapers to a diamond, making it good for thrusting and cutting.
So the Cressy is our first true longsword entry. We're really starting to get into the big boys now.
This is another really good example of something that is just not optimized as a weapon. I mostly use it as an example of what happens when you drastically change the point of balance on something. Because the point of balance on this is like almost a foot from the guard. It's almost unusably unwieldy. These were used for beheading buffaloes, which I believe, because if you want to hit something with one big downward cut, it's got you covered. But any other activity, I would say it does not have you covered. It's pretty hard to move around. There are a lot of cuts that I'm certainly not strong enough to perform with this, and really nobody else I know is either.
Yeah, Brandon pretty much just said it there. This weapon kind of hates you. I'm not even sure if you should call it a weapon, but it was just one of the most difficult things I've ever tried to use in my life. These tests are all pretty basic, and this thing just actively fights you from trying to accomplish it. It's not even the heaviest weapon we tested, but this is why weight by itself doesn't determine how fast or nimble something is.
This here is a Dark Sword Armory Type 18C based off the Alexandria. It has a broad, wide blade at the base, which tapers down to a narrow point. It is a really good thrust and cut sword.
This sword's performance is all over the place, which is really interesting. I've handled more than one Alexandrian sword, and in its defense, I think they're all like the most powerful cutting instruments I've ever seen.
This is the Valiant Armory in collaboration with Angus Trim. It's the Ansbach. It's got a Type 16 blade, which is, well, it's got schmutz on it too. 5160 carbon. It's got the faceted pear pommel. Nice upswept guard with little detail. It's good for cut and thrust. Weighs about 3 pounds.
The Ansbach is just absolutely brilliant. For its length and weight, it actually performed brilliantly. Exceptionally. Its only downfall was using it in one hand, which isn't really a bad thing for a two-handed sword.
This here is a Naga Katana by Shang Swords. It's got a long ska for more reach and maneuverability. The blade profile is that of a Naginata, which wider at the tip, thinner at the base, making it a powerful cutter as it is reinforced. How it thins out towards the tip and then reinforces at the Kasaki, making it good for thrusting.
So the Nagamaki did pretty bad. Though this type of weapon isn't really a sword-fighting sword, this was supposedly an anti-cavalry weapon for low-ranking infantry. Its long handle actually lets you put more power into a cut, but not great for maneuverability.
So this is an Italian rapier. This one's made by Arms and Armor. It's a very faithful reproduction of a specific museum piece from the 1500s. So it's weighted in a very historically authentic fashion. Nice wire-wrapped grip, swept hilt, as is usually the case with such things.
Cool. A very elegant weapon. Slower in cutting actions than similar weapons, but its thrusting speed is respectable, and that's what it's for.
So this is an antique. This is a katana from the 1700s. It was made by the fourth generation of the Tadayoshi line of smiths, which is a very well-known line of Japanese smiths. This one is unusual in that it is fairly large and it is fairly heavy. The point of balance on this is about 7 inches out, so it is an extremely powerful cutter. It is not terribly nimble or terribly easy to use in one hand. There are some interesting decorative elements. I especially like the little rock lobsters in the handle.
So another antique katana. It's hard to know what to call these things as they don't have like official names. But yeah, this was probably the most solid sword I've ever felt in my life. But yeah, being extremely large and very forward-weighted, it's obviously very slow. And I do suspect that maybe we're being a little careful with it, which may or may not have affected its performance.
So this is L.K. Chen's swept hilt rapier. And I use the term rapier loosely, which I guess is kind of the only way to use the term rapier. It's in terms of its blade proportions, it's probably more what a modern practitioner would call a side sword. If you're looking for a rapier to cut tatami with, this is your guy. This thing cuts really, really well, which is not what most people are looking for in a rapier, but we're going to throw it in the test here. It's not particularly heavy or anything like that. It's hard to find a practice rapier for a decent price, and this definitely fits the bill as far as that's concerned.
The heaviest and longest rapier so far, obviously a little bit slower than the others in the cut. What's interesting about this one is that the handle was long enough that we could actually use it in two hands.
This here is a windlass battle cry Bosworth. It has a lenticular blade, which means it's rounded, not diamond. Faceted pommel, and it's primarily for thrusting, but it does pretty decent in the cut.
Oh, Joe. Such a handsome young guy, but he's good at being handsome, but he's not good at talking. The battle cry was very similar in some ways to other longswords, especially the Ansbach. It follows the trends of these longswords not being the best in the first three categories, but being very good in the last three.
So this is a Kriegsmesser by Landsknecht Emporium. Kriegsmesser is just sort of the ultimate weaponization in the Messer family of weapons. So they started off as utility knives, grew in size and offensive capability, and eventually had full-size longswords essentially, but made with, you know, Messer construction, knife construction. Yeah. So otherwise, it handles a lot like a longsword, but it's pretty good for cutting. It's really nice.
So very interesting. The Kriegsmesser equals or outperforms longswords of a similar length, and even outperforms the much lighter Gunther Messer in a few categories.
The Albion Earl longsword. It's an Albion. What can you say? It's just very nice. Like they do a really good job. I'm really happy with it. It's got a really beautiful hollow ground blade. It's very light, very nimble. It's got this great S-shaped quillin, which is pretty neat for, like, if you capture someone's blade and then twist, you can trap it in between your blade and the guard. They can't get it out while you throw a thrust in. It's pretty cool. Yeah. Not tip heavy at all. It's super nimble. Definitely, I would say, equal parts cutter and thruster.
The Earl is very similar to the Kriegsmesser, though their weight distribution is a bit different. The Kriegsmesser is mostly faster, but not completely. But that's forgivable.
Yeah. So this one is an antique. This is a Patah from India. These are really unique. This is just an interesting weapon. Anytime somebody says, well, you know, those didn't exist in real life, I'm like, did you check India? Because they did everything. Actually, a large version of a Qatar, the Indian punch dagger. It's got lots of protection. It is shockingly light. The point of balance is here.
The Patah is one of the reasons why I love Indian weapons. They just came up with some of the coolest stuff. Probably the most unique weapon on this list, the blade is surprisingly floppy. So yeah, this is not a historical weapon, obviously. This is from anime Bleach, but it's freaking huge. This thing is over 8 pounds and is just a solid piece of steel. Point of balance, right about there. Yeah, the thinness of the handle here makes it very uncomfortable to hold this thing. It's not the worst thing in the world, but holding it straight out like this is just not comfortable. There's very little counterweight, and while this thing is only 8 pounds, it feels a little bit heavier. The only hand protection that you get is the fact that the blade kind of protrudes forward a little bit. So as you're holding it out, your hand is covered by the blade. So that's not the worst thing ever. If I were ever to fight with this thing, I think I would keep it pretty much on my shoulders, and I would just be kind of focusing on rolling this thing off for an attack. So yeah, obviously this silly thing doesn't do great. I do think it's kind of cool looking. I think part of this thing's problem is the grip. The handle is just absolutely the worst. And while it is very slow, it at least has some decent length on it, unlike the other extremely heavy weapons we've tested.
This is the Apocalypse Rider by Marto. Very detailed. Each side is different. Different horsemen of Apocalypse. The Angel of Death and Knight armor on both sides.
Sword is special to me because it is the first sword I ever wanted. Has that cool factor to it.
So this was the second heaviest weapon that we tested in the entire thing. I was actually amazed how balanced this thing is despite how heavy it is. And that's because the entire hilt construction is metal. This is purely a wall hanger. But despite its weight, it does do a lot better than the other heavy weapons that we used. This is another very large Scottish sword. This is a Highland claymore as opposed to a lowland claymore. Point of balance, exactly where it needs to be. This is an extremely balanced weapon. The main thing that these swords are known for is their unique crossguard, which has these quarterfoil endings. If you manage to catch an opponent's weapon at exactly the right angle and turn the blade, you can get a nice little sword grab because of the angle. Beautiful. I think this sword is impressively balanced for how heavy it is. Out of all the heavyweight objects that we used in this test, this was the most comfortable, I think. And it manages to keep up with much lighter weapons in certain areas.
Okay, so this is the Cold Steel No Dachi, which is really a nagamaki. It's got the long handle and a big beefy blade in the naginata style. It's got the two fullers, one on the spine and then another in the middle. The handle on the nagamaki should be about the same length of the blade. This one's slightly shorter, I believe maybe almost 10 inches.
So very forward-weighted, as all Japanese swords seem to be. It was very tough doing Zwerchows with this thing.
This is LK Chen's Striking Eagle Chujian. And it's really interesting. One, because this is a really close reproduction of a truly ancient sword. This is one of the oldest Chujians anybody had. I forget the exact date, but it was BC. So thousands of years before you saw similarly sized swords in Europe. It is shockingly light and nimble. It's really good for maneuvering and thrusting. And because it's so long, even though it's light and flexible, the tip speed is incredible and actually makes it a decent cutter as well.
So yeah, the Chujian is, like, incredible. Very, very lightweight for its length. It manages to outperform shorter swords. My guess is that because of the handle length, you have more control over it, and the weight distribution is more manageable because of that.
So this is just a nylon montante trainer. We decided to use this one because it fell in a weight range that we didn't really have represented. And also it's just interesting because the guard is a lot smaller than the steel montante we were using. It kind of changes, I don't know, the way you can apply techniques with it. So it fit what we were trying to do. We decided to use it even though it's a trainer.
Like you said, we just added this one in because there weren't very many weapons in that weight range. One takeaway from this is that it did very bad in the Zwerchow, and I think that might be due to the floppiness of the blade. A little bit of floppiness creating just that extra bit of drag at the termination of a cut, keeping you from making it slower to follow up with the next cut.
So this is a montante by the French smith Fabrice Cugnot. Most of the weight is pretty far back. I think the point of balance on this is only a couple inches from the guard, so despite being huge and heavy, it's pretty nimble. Yeah. These are kind of fascinating because of the whole guard situation. Because it's such a long weapon designed to go up against other long weapons, you need a large guard to provide that defensive angle. And then these guys down here, the little lugs, basically assist with that. So if you were to capture an incoming weapon, it stops there and then won't necessarily be pointed at your face. Whereas if it stops here, it very well could be. Also, they protect your hand while you're, if you're half sorting with it and stuff like that. It's something to hide your hand behind.
I did a whole video on this sword, this exact sword. This is my baby and one of my favorite weapons that I've ever handled. Despite not being particularly fast according to this test, I still love her and don't you dare say a bad thing about her. And while it might be a bit of a slow weapon in terms of other practical weapons, I just want to point out that it's very similar in weight to the Zangetsu, and yet it does far better in several of the tests. So this is the Hero's War Sword by Win the Steelcrafts. This is basically a lowland claymore from the 13th century. Said to be based off of one that belonged to Robert the Bruce. They got these cross guards that are unique to lowland claymores. They're very long, and they've got these cool little hooks that can actually help trap your opponent's weapons. If you catch an opponent's weapon at the right angle, and they try to slide off, they'll get trapped in that little hook at the end of the crossguard. Extremely large handle, makes it very easy to manipulate and swing around. You can see this thing is so big, it's practically knocking into my ceiling. But interestingly here, despite being the same length as the Montante and being lighter, it actually ends up being much slower in certain categories. And while this sword looks cool and has a nice long handle, the blade is very floppy, and that does affect how it does when it's swinging. As I've mentioned with other weapons, it does off-balance things. So this is a halberd by Win the Steelcrafts. The obvious usefulness of this weapon, it has an axe head, this very nasty spike on the back, and it has an armor-piercing spear tip. The shaft isn't rounded like you would expect from a pole weapon, it's actually squared, which makes it unique to handle. This portion of the halberd's blade is actually very important for combat. Treatises show us that this is actually pretty much where you want to catch your opponent's weapon. This portion here is what you're going to use when you're defending yourself against another pole weapon or possibly a large sword or something like that. So we're coming to the end of our test with our first true pole arm. And while I think this weapon is very quick for its size and weight, it was very difficult to pull off Zwerchows with this. And that is a trend with longer weapons that we'll take a look at a little bit later. It has a lot of utility.
This is one of Regagne's Beidenhanders. This is just about one of the biggest actual swords in the test. It's got the full flambeurge style blade. Lots of complications in the crossguard, as they usually did. This guy weighs about 8 pounds, with a point of balance about 7 inches out. So it'll probably be moving a little more sluggishly than some of the other weapons in this test. But as something this size goes, as you can see, it's taller than me. Man, it's got a pretty nimble point for all that.
This sword is so freaking cool. Despite its massive size and weight, it actually outperforms most other heavyweight weapons in most categories.
This is a Yari by HEMA. Even more so than the Naginata. Yari are just super diverse. It really just means spear. There are 1,000 different kinds of these, different lengths, different blade styles, some that can cut, some that can't. Some with very acute points, some with not as acute. It's just a really diverse type of weapon. So this is a Yari, but there are many, many kinds.
So the second last and second longest weapon on this list is the Yari. It is exceptionally quick for its length, as spears are, and I'd say only does poorly in one category.
Naginata by HEMA. Naginata were pretty diverse. There were a lot of different blade profiles, a lot of different lengths, a lot of different styles. Some had guards, some did not. This one is about medium in most regards. But yeah, very standard Japanese polearm, used on the battlefield. Usually as a primary weapon, often you'd carry the katana as a secondary weapon. Very effective at cutting.
So the final weapon in our test. Overall slower than the Yari. I'd say it's overall faster than the Nagamaki, which is a weapon that it's supposed to be similar to in function. Weapons that kind of fill the same role in the battlefield. Yeah, it does very well for its size, and I think Naginatas are one of the coolest weapons in the world. It seems to be a little more competitive with the halberd than it is with the Yari. Alright, so that was a lot of numbers, I know. But what does it all mean? What I think you need is some more numbers and maybe some charts. So here's all the data, entered into a convenient linear regression chart. It's not perfect, but it's all I got. On both sides, we have the time it took to complete each test. On the left side, it's ordered by weight. On the right side, it's ordered by length. The higher it appears on the chart, the slower it goes. The farther it appears on the chart, the longer or heavier the object is, according to which chart it's on. The bigger the slope, the more influence either property had on the object. There's an R-squared value that lets you know how good a linear fit it is. As you can see, every single test that we did had a positive slope, meaning as you increased length or weight, the more time there was spent. So as you can see, weight is more directly affecting results than length in most categories. In fact, length only seemed to be a major factor when it came to the Zwerchhaus or the crosswise cuts. With short weapons, this movement is a simple turn of the wrist and did the best in this category. With larger weapons, this became a huge rotation that required the entire body to essentially swing the weapon all the way around your head. As far as weight goes, that affected the one-handed 90-degree cuts more than anything else. For the heaviest weapons that we tested, the one-handed cuts were basically impossible to perform, at least in a way that you could respectably call a cut. Now, neither length nor weight had a major influence on thrusting. On both charts, it's basically a straight line at the bottom, meaning they weren't affected much by either factor, and they were the fastest. Thrusts from even the heaviest weapons that we tested were quicker than most cuts. But there's a lot more to it than just weight or length. For example, grip matters. Being able to place two hands on the item generally means better control and quicker speeds. For our 90-degree cuts, items are, on average, a little over 19% faster with two hands on the weapon than with one. And in that one-handed cut category, weapons that had shorter handles did better than weapons with longer handles. This is most obvious with the Nagamaki that we tested, and especially that Urukai sword, which absolutely destroyed my elbow to use with one hand. Shafted weapons also have an adjustable grip, so they have more options to manage their weight and length. This all varies from test to test, and sometimes it's hard to quantify. For example, the complexity of certain guards made the Zwerkaus a little bit more difficult to do. I had trouble aligning my edge a couple times with those weapons. And the amount of edges a weapon had mattered. These tests weren't necessarily designed to be fair, and I did go into this with the knowledge that double-edged weapons might have an advantage in certain categories. Now, for smaller weapons, that's not obviously the case. For these up and down cuts, it did feel easier to rise up with the back edge of a sword. It actually wasn't difficult to realign the edge of a single-edged weapon until you get to the heavier ones. Weapons like the Zangetsu and the Buff's Head Kukri were extremely difficult to cut back up with after cutting down to the ground. Realigning the edge with single-edged weapons requires crossing the arms, when performed on this side of the body with a right-handed grip. When doing a rising cut with the back edge, your arms can remain in the same exact position as when they descended downwards. So it's just a matter of pulling back up. Now, when it comes to thrusts, we did do another type of thrust, that is with the non-dominant hand, essentially holding the weapon by the pommel if it had one. I wasn't super sure if this test was very valuable, but I did it anyway for as many weapons as I could remember to do it for or could do it for. And what this does is it extends your reach by thrusting with as much of the weapon as you can by holding it at its very end. Very popular move with fencers in HEMA right now. On average, this thrust will be a little over 14% slower than using a standard version of a thrust. Okay, so that was a lot of info. Maybe more than you're looking for. Maybe you're just looking for a simple, singular number that sums up exactly how fast a weapon is, sort of like a speed stat, so that you can apply it to a game or something like that. Well, don't worry, I've got that too. So here I've taken the 4 most relevant results out of all the tests that we did and combined them together to create a score. It's pretty simple. I took the thrust, the Zwerchaus, the up and down cuts, and either the 2 or one-handed 90-degree cuts based on whether the weapon is considered one-handed or two-handed, added those together, and that creates a nice simple score that kind of sums up each weapon's overall ability. This first category we're looking at is the super heavyweight category is what I'm going to call it. And that is items that are 96 ounces or over or 6 pounds or higher. There's not that many, but several of the weapons in this test weighed anywhere between 6 and 12 pounds, and they're just in a weight class all of their own. So that third number after the item's name is that speed score I was talking about. If one item is 4 points or more higher than another, then they're pretty definitively faster than that other weapon. Now this really highlights how weight obviously matters. The heaviest weapons are not the fastest weapons. But within this category, you can clearly see that balance is what matters more than anything. The sledgehammer is far and away the heaviest item that we tested, but it was certainly not the slowest. The fact that it mostly has a wooden shaft means that you can easily adjust your grip to handle the weight, and you're not forced to deal with all that torque at the very end of the weapon like a sword. And that's what happens with the bottom two on this list, which is the Buff's Head Kukri and the Zangetsu. These two easily had the most uncomfortable handles in the entire test, which made dealing with the extreme amounts of torque that they produced very uncomfortable. At the top of the list, we see the two functional historical swords, the Flamberge Beidenhander and that steel Montante. They're both heavy and long, but extremely well balanced, and it's pretty cool to see that they have the same exact score. Next up, the Sword of the Apocalypse Riders, actually extremely well balanced for how heavy it is, although it is a non-functional wall hanger that uses a lot of material to counterbalance it. The Lowland Claymore that we tested, even though that was the lightest item, it didn't do the best, and that is due to the balance and the fact that the blade flops around a lot. It creates a lot of imbalance when the blade shakes about after you've thrown a cut or a thrust. Alright, the next category is weapons that are about 4 to 6 pounds. These are weapons that are heavy without being considered generally oversized. The results here are interesting. The tree cutting axe is the heaviest item, which is last place in this category. Just above it is the lightest item on the list, and that is the naginata at 64 ounces. The naginata is also the longest weapon that we tested overall. The second lightest item is the Alexandrian sword, which is number 1 on this list. In second place here is that fantasy double-bitted axe, which is very interesting. It scored a 41, which is much higher than the double-bitted wood-splitting axe, even though it's not much lighter, only about 6 ounces lighter. The synthetic montante, the halberd, the Highland claymore, they all did about the same. And it is interesting that the halberd and the naginata are very close to each other. You'll notice that the heavyweight category is almost completely faster than the super heavyweight category. But fact is, it's not by that much, and that's important, because several items in the super heavyweight category are twice as heavy as the ones in the heavyweight category. The heavyweight weapons are only about a third faster, with the flamberge and the steel montante also only being about 9 points beneath the Alexandria, and only about 4 points beneath the much lighter synthetic montante trainer. These are the 3 to 4 pound weapons. The naginata makes an appearance on here, being exactly 4 pounds. So it was the lightest in the last category, heaviest in this one. And, interestingly, still second to last. Now these are all weapons that are considered fairly normal weight, but on the slightly heavier side. Here, joining the naginata is the second longest polearm, that is the yari, which is 7 points faster, that is pretty definitively faster. We also have the nagamaki, which is basically a sword with a naginata blade, which interestingly did just about as well. Right in the middle of this list, we have the 2 lightest weapons, which are also one-handed weapons. That's the laird and the German rapier. Not being able to use 2 hands for leverage does affect the speed of a weapon. At the very top, we have the Ansbach and the Kriegsmesser. Below that, we have the Urukai sword, which is like one of the mysteries of this whole thing to me. I did rate this as a one-handed sword, but the fact is that a lot of the tests that were performed with this weapon were done with 2 hands, so it wasn't done strictly as a one-handed sword as it should have been. If used strictly in one hand, this weapon would not have performed nearly as well. It's almost exclusively used with a shield in the movies. Alright, this next category is items that weigh between 2 and 3 pounds, or between 32 and 48 ounces. This is probably the range that most historical handheld melee weapons fall under, and that's why this is the longest list. The laird makes another appearance here, weighing exactly 3 pounds. So the heaviest item in this category, the lightest in the last one. What's interesting is that it scores very closely to very similar weapons. Right above it is the arming sword by Todd Cutler, and right below it is the so-called Viking sword at 46. At the very bottom of this list, we have one of the heaviest weapons, which is the Hizen Kuniomi Daijo Fujiwara Tadayoshi antique katana. Right above that, another one-handed weapon, the Kora. Not very heavy, but it felt very heavy. In fact, it has the same number as the naginata at 37, which means it would have been second last on the last 3 lists as well. Another one right above that is the Skegox, which is not heavy at all. It's just that, like most axes, its weight was all in the front. And that's also what happened with the Kokatana, which is a specifically forward-weighted cutting katana. Not too far off from it is the Raptor Shobuzukuri, the Tang Dao, which is just as good in one hand as 2. The next one is our other antique sword. That is the Yamashiro no Kami Fujiwara Kunikyo. I hope I pronounced that correctly. Made katana. That is quite light and very well balanced. As legit as katana gets, honestly. One of the many valuable antiques I couldn't believe I was actually able to use for this test, so not something you can see everywhere. The Battlecry Bosworth, probably one of the most balanced longswords I've ever held in my life. In 9th place is probably the most interesting one on this list, and that is the Chujian. You can probably notice that big 60 in green on the inches section. That is by far the longest weapon on this list. And yet it's very close to the top of the list. You're talking about a weapon that's about 5 feet tall. The top of the list is very interesting. First place going to the Jian, then the Albertina, and the Model 1850 officer sword. The Pata, also a straight-bladed weapon, although it is strapped to your arm. That's a very interesting weapon, possibly affected by the fact that the blade has a lot of wobble to it. And then below that, the Windless Raptor and the Defos, which are both fantasy weapons, but made to be functional. Interestingly, they both performed exactly the same. The Gunther Messer, they're just below that. Also very interesting. I considered that a one-handed weapon, just like the Jan. But both of them could be used in two hands, and I did test them in two hands, and their performance was actually better in two hands. So this list would look a lot different if I considered them both two-handed weapons. Comparing this category to the last one is actually far more balanced here. And interestingly, the Ansbach, which is about a pound or more than a pound heavier than the top three items in this category, it scored a 53, which would have placed it in second in this category, which is very interesting because it is about a full pound heavier. Here we see the Jan, the Skegox, and the Gunther Messer all make a return, being at 32 ounces, or 2 pounds exactly. And we can see that the Jan has a rival here, and has been knocked down to 4th place. The Antique Wakizashi having the exact same score. The Skegox down to last place, even though it weighs just as much as the Jan, and is 10 points below the other axe on this list, which is the Norse Hawk, which is a much smaller tomahawk-style axe. That, despite being lightweight, is still forward-weighted, which slows it down just slightly, but still a respectable speed there. The same can also go for the two maces that we tested. The flanged mace and the studded mace, almost identical weapons, but having almost the exact same score. And the top three, we start getting into the items that completely outclass everything that we've seen so far by quite a bit. That is the Bruegel Messer, the Cinquedilla, and the Burnware Messer. Both Messers being made by Todd Cutler, the Burnware Messer being only about a pound. But these are far faster than any of the weapons that we've come across so far. The most exceptional, I think, being the Cinquedilla, which weighs closer to 2 pounds. All right, and finally, these are the items that are under a pound. I call this the ultra lightweight category because it sounds cool. But here you can see the Burnware Messer make another appearance. With practically the same score as the Machete, weighing only 13 ounces. Being slightly longer might have affected its performance. But the top three are the most significant ones by a long shot. These were the top three in every single category, in this exact order, every single time, uniformly, through the entire test. The third place going to the Tanto, with a score of 75, which is way higher than any other item that is underneath it. After that is the Quillon Dagger at 87. And the lightest and shortest weapon, the pocket knife, with a score much higher than any other weapon that we tested at 97. So there you have it. It took me about 2 years to complete this test because I kept on adding more weapons, and I had to stop myself from adding even more. So was it worth it? I absolutely think so. Some of the results were obvious, but I feel like some of them were a complete surprise. And while it's impossible to say that we proved anything with a test like this, certainly it's possible that 3 other people could have came up with very much different results. There's definitely trends in the results that paint a very clear picture of the range that certain types of weapons fall into when it comes to speed. But more importantly, I think it acts as a resource. In the beginning of the video, I asked you how much faster a Quillon Dagger was from a 7-pound Montante. Well, the answer is about 2.4 times faster. Which is crazy considering that the Montante is over 16 times heavier. But I bet you wouldn't have guessed that when you first started watching this video. And that tree axe? The axe was slightly slower despite being much smaller in every way. And now you know. And hey, if you're trying to use this as a resource to build like a game or something like this, I think these stats are pretty valuable. The last set of numbers that I showed you, the pocket knife scored a 97. Which, if you think about it, the pocket knife is pretty much 100% of our ability. It's the weight of it doesn't restrict our ability to move our arms at all. So you can kind of consider it pretty much as close to 100% of our ability as I think possible while having something in your hand. Meaning you can kind of use the other scores as a percentage, really. So you can apply that to some kind of weapon parameter. You know, the Zangetsu is 23% of my maximum ability. You know, these other great swords being 32 to 36% of my maximum ability. Either way, there's a lot more we can do with this. I would really like to do more tests that are more hyper-focused on certain weapon types. And I'd like to bring in people who are specifically proficient at those weapons. And I'd also like to clean the test up, make it a little more structured. Make it a little smaller so it's not such a huge task to get it done. But that's really all dependent on if people are interested in this kind of thing. So I hope you'll support this video. If you have opinions or suggestions, please leave them down below. I have access to a lot of different weapons from all over the world, antiques, crazy fantasy weapons, you name it. But that's all I got for now. Until next time.